a past Writers of the Future winner and recent recipient of the Sidewise Award for his alternate history novel, Hot Moon. Edward Willett, Aurora-winning author, The Tangled Stars. They're all represented by a prior podcast guest, book publicist Mickey Mickelson, who I want to publicly thank for originating this podcast. It was his idea, and I thought, never done it before, and so this has been quite a challenge, but I'm very excited to see how this is going to come out. I have a personal policy of reading at least one work of any authored guest I have on the show, so I had quite some homework to prepare for today's show. Anyway, hello and welcome, Jeffrey, Edward, Alan, and Edward.
Hello.
Hi,
hello.
Happy to be here.
Yes, definitely happy to have you. So I'm just going to run through each one of you first for a brief little discussion about yourself as an author and your current project. What I read was, I'll start with Jeffrey Carver, Reefs of Time. I read that one there and I was just like, I got totally sucked into it. I wasn't able to read the second one because I had 3 more books to read after that one. But it really came across me as a cross between Doc Smith and Larry Niven's Ring World. So anyway, you created and hosted an educational TV series for middle school students, science fiction and science and fantasy writing. So anyway, welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, just a brief overview about your
brief capsule. Okay. I've been publishing science fiction since the 1970s. I'm probably best known for 2 series, the Star Rigger universe, in which was set, just a slight correction, my Nebula finalist was for Eternity's End, which was part of the Star Rigger universe, and the Chaos Chronicles, which I have focused on more in recent years, and the pair of novels that were published a couple of years ago, The Reefs of Time and Crucible of Time, were really written as one novel, but it was too large to be published as one, so it was split into 2, and that's how that. And so I'm now working on the final book of that series, tentatively called Masters of Shipworld, and I'm glad you enjoyed it, John.
Me too. Okay, good. And then Edward Lerner, Ed, he's a physicist and computer scientist with 23 published books, including 5 with Larry Niven, as I said. There we got Best of EML, and there I really enjoyed Time Out. And we're going to get into some questions with everybody also just on how dealing with fast and light travel and time travel and not. But anyway, so Ed, please a brief overview about yourself.
Okay. As John said, I started out in physics and computer engineering, and I worked in high tech for quite a while with writing science fiction as my hobby. I've been published for about 30 years. In 2004, after I sold my second novel, meaning the first wasn't a fluke, I switched to writing full time. Most of my writing has been novels, but I also have dozens and dozens and dozens of shorter works. And faced with the sometimes challenging question of which of my books do I like best, I put together an anthology, or rather a collection, The Best of Edward M. Lerner, which is a career-spanning collection of 14 pieces of shorter fiction at every length, from flash fiction, which is 1,000 words, to a novella. Time Out, that John mentioned, is one of my favorites. It's a time travel story in which the main character has absolutely no technical background and has to struggle to figure out how this time travel thing works and how much trouble he's really in. And the short answer, of course, is a lot.
A whole lot. Great, thank you. And Alan Smale, a past Writers of the Future winner and recent recipient of the Sidewise Award for his alternate history novel, Hot Moon, which is seriously hot and seriously cool. Intense action, a really great female protagonist on this thing, seriously intense. So hello, Alan.
Hello. Thanks for having me on. Yes, my name's Alan Smale. I've been published since the 1990s. Mostly in those days, my output was short stories. I've had about 50 stories published, including 4 in Asimov's science fiction magazine. So my stories have appeared in magazines and original anthologies, including, as you said, the Writers of the Future anthology, volume 13. Yes, I've won the Sidewise Award twice.
This one.
Yep, that's it. Yes, I've won the Sidewise Award twice, actually. The first time was in 2011 for a novella called A Clash of Eagles, which became the first part of my Clash of Eagles novel. The Clash of Eagles series is a trilogy. Clash of Eagles itself, Eagle in Exile, and Eagle in Empire, and they came out from Random House between 2015 and 2017. And the idea behind those books is that the Roman Empire has survived in its classical form until the 13th century and is now moving into North America. For the last 10 or 15 years, basically everything I've written has been either alternate history or historical fantasy. I have written fantasy and horror in the past, but now I'm really locked into the alternate history side of things, as you could guess from the Sidewise Awards. I did have a short novel out called The Wandering Warriors, which was time travel. That was out from Wordfire Press, and that's a collaboration with Rick Wilbur. And as you said, my most recent book is Hot Moon, which is out from Kasich, Ark Manor, and that's a much more contemporary alternate history. And that's my alternate Apollo novel, set in 1979, in a universe where the US Apollo program continues, and the Russians are also still attempting to go to the moon. And so lots of excitement ensues in that alternate 1979. So that's me.
All right. And then last but not least, Edward Willett, War Aurora winning author. And the book that I read of his is The Tangled Stars. I'm really anxious to talk about all of you about the whole subject of fast light travel and how to get around Einstein's apparent bar that's been set, that's been hard to, or hasn't been passed yet. So I'll bet you're about yourself, Edward.
Well, I am, as I always say in my little potted bio, I'm the award-winning author of more than 60 books of science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction for readers of all ages. I started as a newspaper reporter and editor in my 20s for my hometown newspaper. I was communications officer at the Saskatchewan Science Center for a while and got really interested. Even before that, I was interested in writing about science as well as writing science fiction. I actually started writing science fiction in the 70s, but I wasn't published in the 70s. I was writing in high school quite a bit. My first book came out in the 90s. It wasn't science fiction. It was using Microsoft Publisher for Windows 95. And I did a lot of that kind of thing. I've written about every topic under the sun for educational publishers. I wrote Genetics Demystified for McGraw-Hill without knowing a thing really about genetics before I wrote it. The Tangled Stars is my 12th novel for Dawes. So Dawes is my major publisher. I've written for a lot of smaller publishers as well, both science fiction and fantasy, and under my own name and under a couple of pseudonyms, Lee Arthur Chain and E.C. Blake. And I have my own podcast I would very much like to mention because it would be of interest to the listeners. I have a podcast called The World Shapers, where I interview other science fiction and fantasy authors about their creative process. And that's up to episode 118, I think, as of the last one. And I've interviewed many of the biggest names in the field. And yeah, so I think anybody interested in writing and learning about the creative process of other writers might want to check out my podcast, as well as my books.
Absolutely. What's your podcast?
It's called The World Shapers, and it's at theworldshapers.com.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you for that overview. So now the next thing I wanted to go over, because again, that's the audience that we've got here as aspiring writers, like the biggest obstacles you had to overcome as a writer, if there were times you were ready to give up or, that you then had to deal with to be able to persist. So this one here, I'm not going to be quite so, A to Z, A to Z, A to Z. So anybody can answer if you want to on this thing or not, but just where you had obstacles you had to overcome and times you were ready to give up, but then you persisted or somebody helped you or something that gave you that extra spark to just one more time, and then you actually then made it over the hump.
Okay, don't everyone speak at once, right?
We're all thinking really hard.
Yeah. After my first novel came out, I was in a new day job that gave me way too little time to write. I was working 6 days a week, long days on a good week, and too often 7 days a week. And it was very hard to believe I'd ever get back to writing. So when I set aside novels for a bit and switched over to writing short stories, and actually could finish a project in a reasonable period of time and sold a couple of them, that was very encouraging.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was Ed Lerner. Anybody else on that? Or you guys have all like were born with a silver spoon in your typewriter and it just went from there? Yeah, okay, Jeff.
I'll
Yes.
jump in if you like. Well, I started writing seriously in college and in the couple of years following college, and collected rejection slips for years. And what at that point, what kept me going was my belief that somehow I could write better than the people who were publishing this stuff that I didn't think was all that good. This was total hubris and ignorance because I wasn't really that good a writer yet. And the biggest obstacle was learning to tell stories that people would want to read and would want to pay for. And it's not an easy job to learn the craft of writing. And it involves all sorts of things about learning to create characters, learning to create plot, learning to structure a world. And these things I didn't really have any outside help at the time. So I was fumbling along, driven by my own belief. And once I was published and I became part of a writers group and I had more input into all of these things, oddly enough, as the years went on and my career went on, I probably became less convinced of my own wonderfulness of a writer and had more periods of doubt. And I can tell you there are countless times when I was ready to just throw in the towel and say, this is it. I've done my best work. It's not coming again. And literally through my entire career, this has happened over and over. But I always keep plugging. And now I have the support of my family and my group who say, no, you haven't lost it yet. Just settle down. It will come again. Keep working. And then it does. And I've had some terrific editors over the years, too, who have helped me.
I got to say that Reefs of Time was just amazing. So, and I started with the second book and I got lost. So then you said, no, you need to start with Reefs of Time, which made all the difference.
Yeah. You jumped into the middle of the story. So,
it was.
So that would be hard.
But it was amazing. It was a great story. And just, like I said, if it wasn't for the fact that I had 4 more books to read or 3 more books to read, I would have gone right on, which I probably will when I get Windows to be able to read the next one, because it was just so entertaining.
Well, I hope you do. And I'll just note that it took me 11 years to write that pair of books. And there were definitely periods during that time when I thought this is never going to be finished. And yet, in the end, it was. And I moved on.
You done did good. All right. And anybody else have any? Alan, yes.
Okay, yeah, I would certainly agree with Ed Lerner that one of the major problems has been finding time. I wrote when I was a kid. I can't remember a time in my life when I wasn't writing as well as reading, although my early writing was atrocious. And so I did write when I was very young and into my teenage years. And then I had to kind of stop because I was studying at college. I went to Oxford and I was studying for my degrees and going on from there and trying to make a career for myself. And so that left very little time for writing. And I really didn't do any writing during my 20s. I decided in my 30s that I was really going to get back into it. And that was when I started selling short fiction. But there have been many times during that period when I've had difficulty finding time to write. And the other issue is that there are ups and downs in the writing business, right? I think just about everybody will tell you this. And I did have a fair amount of success with the Clash of Eagles trilogy that came out from Del Rey. But after that, Del Rey didn't actually want the next book I was trying to sell. And the pandemic came along, and I had these novels that I was trying to push. My agent was trying to sell, and we were basically having no success. And I admit to thinking during that time, maybe I just had my time. I had my big contract and I'm not going to get anything again. And that does happen to people. A lot of people who are publishing their first novels around the same time as me haven't published anything since, haven't been able to publish anything since. So I thought, well, maybe that's it. I still had confidence that I could write short fiction and probably place short fiction. But I thought maybe the publishing business has changed. Maybe it's moved along. Maybe people don't want the kinds of things that I write anymore. And so my confidence did take a boost. As I say, I don't think there was a point where I was ever going to give up, but certainly there were times when it was hard to find the day-to-day resilience to keep sitting down at the keyboard and typing more and going ahead and trying to do the thing and carry on doing that. And as you know, I've sold another book since then, and that seems to be doing well. So my confidence is back up. I'm up the wave again right now, but who knows? I may be down the wave again in another couple of years.
Well, let's just hope it's not a sine curve here. Let's just hope it's just a straight.
Yeah, the sine curve would kind of suck a bit.
Yes.
I would say that the biggest challenge for my writing has been my writing. It's because I'm split in these two areas, right? I've been a full-time freelance writer since 1993, and I do anything for a buck as a freelance writer. So I've written everything you can imagine. I used to have a science column. I wrote entertainment news. I interviewed people like Weird Al Yankovic for the newspaper at one point. Very good interview, by the way.
Yeah.
I hosted a TV program, and I recently, like 4 years ago, I started my own publishing company, and that's a huge, huge sink of time that pulls away from my writing. When I first decided to go freelance, I said I was looking forward to being my own boss and writing all I wanted. And somebody told me, you may find that you had more time to write what you want to write before you had to make a living at it. And I think that's true. So my focus, there's always the stuff I have to do in order to make a few dollars. And the fiction, unfortunately, pays some, but it doesn't pay enough to make a living. Fortunately, I married an engineer, which is something I recommend to anybody who's a freelance writer. But, you may not be able to manage that. Or some other professional, always a good choice. But yeah, so my challenge has often been, I want to write things I want to write, but I have to write stuff I don't want to write as much because that's my job.
Right.
And that's actually been the challenge. I've never been tempted to give up writing. I don't know how one does that. So my wife says she gets to retire and I get to slump over the keyboard. That's kind of our plan.
That's what it is. Yeah. So I have a question now. When I was reading all the different books, there was, Alan, you had obviously your alternate history, and that one there was just amazing. How you start with a known datum and you finish with a known datum, and everything between is Alan's datums or Alan's data, which is fascinating how that happened. Then afterwards, okay, let's look at these timelines, and it was just like, wow, it was really cool how this is what's happening and this is how it went down. And it was probably what you had to write was way more exciting than what actually went down for real. Maybe not, but I certainly hope not. I hope yours was way much more exciting than what really went down with your the railgun on the moon and the whole thing there in atomic warfare and whatnot that took place up on the moon. But on the subject of fast and light travel. So is it a thing of like where everyone's convinced that Michelangelo painted dark and that's what it was. And then someone actually checked and found out that it was just the accumulation of centuries of candle smoke that clouded the artwork. And he really had very bright, artwork up there. And it would totally demystify this whole thing which was a wrong channel that everybody's going with. There were even books coming out explaining why Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel so dark. Are we looking at the same thing here with what we've got seem to be locked in with Einstein's can't go faster than the speed of light? Does anybody have any comments on that? Because there's all types of other ways with the wormholes and with other windows and portals and whatnot to accomplish getting other places in less than 50 lifetimes.
I think it's quite likely that it is not possible to do the things we do in science fiction to get around that limit. Sometimes the universe just is what the universe is, and there are certain physical laws that you can't. We're not all Scotty the Star Trek engineer who can break the laws of physics because the captain told him he had to. But at the same time, who knows? And because we don't know what we don't know, we don't know. Right. What discoveries there might be in the future. So when it comes to writing fiction, as you know, in The Tangled Stars, a lot of it is about this idea of a way of getting around that called, what did I call them? Multiverse adjacent space-time tunnels. Exactly. And they're described as like sort of between multiverses, there's this non-space that you can enter and then pop out back into your own universe somewhere else. Why not? And wormholes were done, and I just wanted to have a different acronym. And I've used other things in the past, and it's usually just taking something like brain surfing, BRANE or something like that, and waving your hands. So I don't know, Clark's law comes into place. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and maybe somebody out there has found something that we haven't. But in the meantime, with some exceptions, I think most of us using faster than light travel are just waving our hands, and we're really writing fantasy, but we're putting a scientific sheen on it.
Well, there's
Yeah.
certainly some truth to that. In addition to writing mostly science fiction and techno thrillers, I occasionally write popular science. And in my popular science book, Troping the Light Fantastic, the science behind the fiction, there's a long chapter on workarounds if you can't travel faster than light, things like generation ships and suspended animation, and another chapter on how you can seemingly go faster than light without going faster than light. There are some exceptions here. General relativity has loopholes of sorts. So, wormholes are the best known, but there are also variations like, what happens if a multiverse is possible? Ed was not taking seriously the possibility of crossing over into another universe or between universes where the physical laws might be different, but it's respectable science to speculate that our universe is only one of many universes, and that the parameters that are totally mysterious if there's only one universe are easily explained if it's one of many, many, many universes, and that you can pick and choose and find one with much faster light speed. You only need to figure out the small problem of how you cross over and then cross back. And it turns out, and I discuss in Troping the Light Fantastic, that there are lots of these possibilities that are considered serious science.
Okay, well, Jeff Carver, he solved that. So, Jeff, talking about that, what you did to solve that one with your, that was, again, with the series, or at least the first book that I read there.
Well, if you're referring to, I'm not sure which part of it you refer to. I have something called the Star Stream, which was a creation that came from a different novel involving a hypercosmic string that was bound to a black hole at either end and became a sort of interstellar express route toward the center of the galaxy. I have people traveling through K-space, N-space, which are just different dimensional layers. I'm not very specific at all about what those are. My basic operating philosophy is that I have the greatest respect for Einstein and relativity, but I believe that we only know a small fraction of all of physics at this point, and that there are any number of possibilities that may emerge. So my Star Rigger universe is actually predicated on them, as far as I know, a fairly unique. That's a bad phrase. Aspiring writers don't say fairly unique. In the Star Rigger universe, the ships travel through a sort of hyperspatial layer in which there are currents, like undersea currents, that go from one place in space to another, and is unrelated to distances in normal space. And the pilots, who are called Star Riggers, use a sensory net to reach out into the current, and the way they navigate is by overlaying their own mental fantastic imagery on an existing layer, and it's a sort of merging of the imagination of the rigger with the actual topology that they're navigating through. And this was, I wrote about this in a short story, and then it just sort of blossomed into a series of books. But that's what star rigging is all about. And if you want to call that fantasy, I won't complain. If you want to call it hard science fiction, I won't complain. People have called it both. So, there are dragons in that one of the layers of the continuum. So there are elements of fantasy in it. But it's also,
although Anne McCaffrey argued until the very end that she never wrote anything but science fiction with the Dragon Riders of Pern, because they were all created through science.
That's
and
right.
I had many conversations with her about that.
That's right.
So now you've all got, combined science degrees here. I could probably stack up a sheaf of papers, half a foot thick, just stacking them up between the four of you. So how much does science come into play to either, how do you use your science to write your stories? Because obviously you've got all your training, Einstein says, and that's kind of like what we're dealing with right now with the level of science. And to say Einstein wasn't correct, you run into unwillingness for people to suspend their disbelief. So how do you fit in your science with your science fiction? Alan? Yeah.
Well, can I jump in as a non-scientist? I'm a science junkie. I love science. I don't have a science degree. I've never done science. So I use science with the utmost care combined with wild imagination. And to me, this is just how my stories come together. So it is very important to me that in my stories, when I use, say, world building elements in which a scientific sensibility is important, I try to be very faithful to real science. I will extrapolate from it. I will extrapolate wildly, but it's always based in what my own understanding of science is. So you would not use my books as a primer for science as we know it now. But if you know science, I don't think you'll be too upset by what I've done. So I think it's important to respect the reader's, literacy about science, or maybe bolster it a little bit. And maybe after other people have spoken, I want to put in a plug for something about astronomy and science that might be
good. Okay, so we'll circle back around with you, Jeff. So Alan, you had something to say.
Yeah, I was going to say that generally you get to cheat once, right? You get to, when you're writing science fiction, you can have one thing that breaks the laws of physics, but everything else you have to play fair with. So in this case, some of the writers here maybe have stipulated that you can have faster than light travel, or they've had multiverse ways of going faster than the speed of light. But in other ways, they've presumably played fair to the laws of physics throughout. And that's one thing that I think a lot of people do. Maybe you have telepathy as the one non-physical thing, but everything else is physically correct. Specifically in my own work, and specifically with Hot Moon, which is actually hard science fiction. It's alternate history, but it's very hard science fiction as well. In that case, I'm definitely using the science and technology of the Apollo program, extrapolated out to 1979, which is not very far from 1972 when we stopped going to the moon. But I've totally played fair with all the laws of physics there. I actually have spreadsheets where I've described, well, for my own use, where I've been figuring out like how much fuel it takes to do certain things, to make orbit changes, what the angle of the sunlight on the moon would be at certain times, all of the times and phases and illuminations work out, because I know that there are people that are going to be looking for things like that. Specifically in my case, I didn't mention this earlier, but in my day job I work at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. My background is in physics. I'm nowhere near the human spaceflight program. I'm a research scientist in a completely different area, but I know that there are going to be people who know me and who are going to be wanting to read the books and know that everything in there is going to be scientifically and technologically accurate, and so I owe them that. And the people that don't know me, I owe them that as well. I want them to have the experience of reading this book about the Apollo program and having the feeling that it's as technologically sound as I can make it, and that everything in there is going to be faithful to the laws of physics and to the technologies that we had at the time. So that was what I was aiming to do with that particular book.
Yeah, Hal Clement talked about, he was one of our judges earlier on, how he would write hard science, but he had something wrong on the gravitational spin on one of the planets, and he was caught out on it. He said, yeah, I didn't do my research properly on that one there. So he said, you've got to have your science right on stuff, where you're going to have some people to come in. Larry Niven on Ringworld definitely said people commenting on different aspects of it that weren't correct on the science of it, that he had to come back and correct later on in that.
Yes, that's one of the reasons why he wrote the second Ringworld novel, was so that he could correct some of the things about the first Ringworld novel, where the Ringworld itself is actually unstable under certain circumstances. So he had to figure out how he could stabilize it and put that into the Ringworld engine.
Exactly. So either of the Eds have anything to say?
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Okay, Mr. Lerner, yes.
Okay. The first rule of writing fiction is you have to make life difficult for your protagonists. And there are lots of ways to do that. And the way I do it typically is people have to live within the way the physical universe works. My most recent novel, called Deja Doomed, takes place mostly on the moon. And like Alan, I dipped very heavily into the archives of the Apollo program for that. What it would be like if you actually wanted to try to live on the moon and travel on the moon. Now, my fictional component in that book was, once on the moon, someone stumbles across an ancient alien artifact, and no one could possibly be native to the moon, so there's high tech to be found, and everyone wants to get their hands on it. So, physics and biology, how you could actually survive in that environment, provided all the constraints to make life very, very difficult for my characters.
And I would just
Okay.
say that when I'm using science, when I'm researching science, that can actually, interestingly enough, drive plot points, if things you haven't thought about. So I did a story which wasn't what it was. It was faster than light ships that leapfrogged past a generation starship. So this generation starship shows up, and it's been traveling at relativistic speeds. This is a book called Right to Know. And it gets there, and humans are already there because they got faster than light travel while they were creeping along, and they're waiting for them when they get there. And it's what happens at that point. But among the things I was researching was like how fast this ship had to spin in order to create gravity. And it was slower than I thought it was. So if I had just done it without doing the research, it would have changed the scene. But I found out it was actually about a walking speed for the size of the ship that this was. It wasn't tremendously fast, which was interesting to me. I didn't know that. And another thing I ran across, I have a book back here about building starships, that they're very, very, in a very, very complicated machine, like I don't remember how big my ship was, but it had multiple thousands of people on it. Something is breaking like every minute somewhere on that ship, which then gave me the idea of having these maintenance robots running around, and they became integral to the plot. So as you try to make your science real, it also, as Ed says, science makes things difficult for your characters and makes the story better as well.
Okay, that's great. So, yeah, these are all things that anybody who is attempting to write hard science, what you need to deal with, because obviously if you're writing hard science fiction, you're going to have to break some rules, because otherwise it's no longer science fiction. But how do you do that and make it so that, I think the key thing on science fiction is, how do you get it so that the reader is totally open and willing to suspend their disbelief in what your storytelling is, so they can go along. And I think what I think it was you, Alan, saying, you've got to have, if you're going to have one piece of science that is fictionalized, everything else around it has to be sound science, so that you can kind of like meld them together into a story that takes you into a different direction, but is still somewhat plausible. So now yeah. Oh yeah, you had one more thing you wanted to say, Jeff.
Can I just make a plug for the writer who's interested in learning more about astronomy and how to use that accurately in their fiction? There's an annual program called the Launchpad Astronomy Workshop that's held at the University of Wyoming every year, every summer, hosted by Mike Brotherton, who's a science fiction writer and astronomer. It was originally funded by NASA and National Science Foundation, specifically to help science fiction writers and other writers to get the science right, and thus to communicate it to readers. It's a great program. As far as I know, it's still ongoing for next year. And just look up Launchpad Astronomy Workshop online. You'll find it. And if you're a writer who's looking to learn more about this,
It's
check
excellent.
it out.
That's great.
I highly recommend it.
It's excellent. I've been
Oh,
there
good.
too.
So now, as I announced when we first were putting this interview together, this podcast is based on Rise of the Future. So any other particular tips and suggestions for aspiring writers? And I'd like to start first with Alan, because you've actually won the Rise of the Future contest. You came out to the workshop, and so you've read several of Mr. Hubbard's essays. So anything, first of all, about the contest, any of the essays that you remember, this far into the future, and any of the stories from Mr. that you've read that for you have been particularly significant.
Yeah, so this was quite a while ago. I took second place in the Writers of the Future in 1996. And so I went to the workshop that was run for the Writers of the Future winners in 1997. And that was a great experience. I had actually entered the Writers of the Future contest 7 times prior to winning. And I'd been a finalist once, but I hadn't won previously. There were many things about that was great. It gave me the impetus to write a story every 3 months that I thought was good enough for consideration in the Writers of the Future contest. And even back then, I knew that there were a lot of people who were going on to make successful careers who'd come through the Writers of the Future contest and the workshop itself. And there are many people now who I consider to be friends and colleagues who came up through that route, who were Writers of the Future winners in the past. In terms of essays by L. Ron Hubbard, there was one that was actually featured in the book that my story was in, the Writers of the Future 13, that came out that year. And it's actually a very short piece. It's like a two-page piece, and it's called The Fast Production Writer. It's a short essay, and what he was doing there was pushing back against the idea that being prolific is somehow the enemy of quality, right? He was saying that it's not necessarily the people who are writing in their garrets and writing one short story a year who are the big people in the field. It's the people who are actually pushing really hard and pushing fast to get as many words down as possible. And being L. Ron Hubbard, he obviously had some skin in that game as an extremely prolific writer. But I think he's right. And one of the points he was making was that people like Dickens and O. Henry and Walter Scott, they wrote a heck of a lot. They wrote all the time. And he says that he wrote some of his best stuff in the white heat of typing. And I think that's good advice. And one of the things that I got out of that was to speed myself up in a way, to not quite think, not spend so much time thinking, but write. Because like in L. Ron Hubbard, in this very tiny sense, a lot of my good ideas come when I'm writing quickly, and that kind of untaps my subconscious, or taps into my subconscious, and gives me ideas that I didn't know I had in the past. I obviously have that slow, deliberative time where I'm thinking through plots, but also that white heat of writing fast is quite important to me. And so I think that's good advice for young or journeyman writers, people who are coming up through, is to not necessarily be kind of held back by thinking that you have to get everything right in your head before you put things down on paper, but just to write, just to do it and do it as much as you can. Because you can always throw away stuff that doesn't work, but the idea is to get as much out as you can and work with what you have then.
Thank you. And then what about the workshop or the value from your perspective to an aspiring writer for entering the workshop or participating in Writers of the Future? And all this stuff is on writersofthefuture.com, which this podcast will be on too shortly, because we have the free online workshop, we've got the podcast, we've got a blog, we've got also Enter the Writer contest and Illustrator contest, and we have the last 38 years worth of winners and events that people can see too. But what do you think is like one of the more supportive parts, or one of the most important parts of why someone should enter the contest?
Well, I got to meet a lot of great people. There were a lot of writers. There are a lot of really top name writers like Tim Powers and Kevin Anderson and Nancy Kress. And a lot of these people I've met again more recently. But that was my first exposure to writers of that caliber who were willing to just sit down afterwards. We would chat for long periods of time about their writing experience. And they were very encouraging and very helpful and very nurturing. It was great to meet people who were like at the top of their game when I was down somewhere near, bottom to approaching the mid part of my game, I guess. So that was a great experience of the workshop. It was great to be taken seriously as a writer, because I always got the feeling that the people at the Writers of the Future were serious about this, and it wasn't just a publicity gimmick or something like that. They were really invested in trying to bring out new writers and to help us all along. And I did meet some people there, like the professional writers and also my peers in the workshops, who I stayed in touch with for a while afterwards. And writing is a very lonely thing. I think a lot of writers would agree with this. You spend a lot of time on your own in a room with a typewriter in the old days, or with a laptop now, or with pen and paper. And so it is good to have a sense of community and to get with other
Mhm.
writers. And you can get some of that from conventions, but going to writers' workshops or being involved in something really high-powered, like the Writers of the Future contest, I think is very worthwhile, and I found it very worthwhile myself.
Great, thank you. All right, that's good. So, in terms of tips, and we'll just finish with you, then we'll open up to the others as well. Any other tips that you can originate about, writing or breaking in or anything like that that you think would be helpful for the aspiring writer?
Well, I've spoken a lot, so I'll just say a couple of things very quickly. To write a lot, you need to read a lot, especially at the beginning. You need to read people you admire. You need to kind of take apart what they're doing, figure out what makes it work. Maybe read once for fun and then once in an analytical way to see what the tricks of the trade are. Because writing is an art and a craft. And by honing the craft, it helps to stimulate you on the art side to be more imaginative. And another thing is persistence. There are going to be downtimes. There are times when you think you're not going to be able to sell anything. There are times when you may have sold things but not selling anything in the future, or you might not be have the confidence. But I think it is important just to persist and keep working at it, and things will turn around eventually.
Great. Anybody else with your comments on tips that you give for the aspiring writer?
What Alan's said is what I say all the time. You have to read and you have to write. I've been writer in residence at the Regina and Saskatoon Public Libraries, working with people who bring in whatever they want, they're working on, and I try to help them with it. And I've mentored writers. And so those are absolutely. The other one that I often come across and think of is you have to learn to let go of the love of your own prose. And you have to be willing to change it and fix it and throw stuff away.
Yep.
A couple of times, it didn't happen very often, but there were times when I was working with a wannabe writer as a writer in residence, and you could just see it. Their back went up like a cat arching its back when you said, maybe you didn't want to use 27 adverbs in that one paragraph or whatever it was. But I love, or there was another one I was critiquing. I was actually editing it, and I made some offhand comment about the fact that a character had gotten stabbed in the heart and continued talking for about 3 paragraphs. And I said, this isn't Hamlet, right? People don't keep these long soliloquies as they're. But he was really upset because he had poured his heart and soul into that, and he loved that character, and it was this poignant moment when the character was dying. But for somebody looking from it from outside, it was just wrong and kind of silly. You have to be able to not take it personally when somebody tells you that maybe you did something that isn't really working. You also have to be strong enough in your own mind to not take every piece of advice like that you get from readers, because there can be people who don't know what they're talking about. So it's a delicate balance. But yeah, don't be in love with your own stuff. Be willing to change it. Be willing to make it better.
Got it. What about yourself, Ed Lerner?
Oh, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I'd emphasize that there's a lot of rejection in this game, especially when you're new to it. But throughout, nobody sells everything they write the first time, no matter how accomplished they are, how well known they are. So get used to rejection. And when you reach the point where the rejection is not a form letter, but pages of everything that's wrong with your writing, that's progress. Editors are very busy people, and if they take the time to tell you what's wrong, they're actually trying to encourage you.
Good. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the third thing I'll offer, and then I'll hand off, is what works for one writer is not necessarily the best for another writer. There's nothing wrong with trying a whole bunch of different ways to work, and pounding out lots of text isn't necessarily the best for every writer. Some people need to plot and ponder and go for long walks to work through details. And if they have a few days when they don't add anything to the Word file, it's okay. Do what works for you.
Good. All right. And Jeff?
You guys have covered it astonishingly well. So I'll just add a few things around the edges here. Persistence is absolutely paramount. Seeking out good criticism, whether it's attending a workshop or becoming part of a critique group, and being open to receiving intelligent criticism is crucial. knowing when to accept and when to reject a particular piece of criticism is equally crucial, because not every piece of criticism is on the mark. Sometimes somebody will suggest a way to do something differently, and that will tell you that, okay, something isn't working here. The suggested fix isn't necessarily the right one. I've done this with editors numerous times where they've said, I think you need to do this scene like that. And I'll say, okay, it isn't working for you. I don't like your solution. I'll come up with a different solution, but address the problem nonetheless. And although I don't believe that people who are really early in their careers should be focusing too much on publishing or having visions of grand publications in the future. I mean, that's always something you aspire to, but be aware that the publishing landscape has simply been through a Vitamix blender over the last 10, 20 years. It is nothing like what it was when I entered the field, and particularly not so much for short fiction, because there are short fiction markets you'll want to submit to, but book publication, traditional publishing is the best route for some people. Indie publication is the best route for other people. And it's a real Wild West out there now in terms of publishing. So be prepared for all kinds of eventualities. Great. And always strive to write better.
Now, one thing that's been brought up a couple of times is the traditional route, indie and self. So any particular...
Well, I'll say something because I did start a publishing company. So I always saw myself as being traditionally published, and that's when I started. And that's what I was working forward to then. But I did at some point, what drove me to start a publishing company in my case was I had all these publishers who had died on me, not literally, but their companies had gone away. It feels like I killed them, but I didn't really. And so the rights came back to me, and I wanted to get those books out there. And then in the process of doing that, I had other people were writing stuff that I thought, I could do something with that. And the next thing you know, I'm doing what is really a traditional publishing company, but I'm operating very much in a kind of indie print-on-demand landscape. And I have self-published in the sense that I have published myself through my publishing company. But at the same time, I'm also publishing other people. And it's like Jeffrey says, I'm doing this and I still don't know what I'm doing. So, or whether I'm doing the right thing, or if because you see the people who are self-publishing and making astonishing amounts of money in sales, and more than I ever have in my life. And so it is really hard to know what's the best route for anyone.
Traditional publishers tend to be very rigid in what they want. They want what sold last year. And if you're comfortable writing what was popular, the 57th vampire book, you may be a better match for traditional publishing. And I published in traditional and small press. And sometimes I'm perfectly happy writing what's popular. But if I want to write something that's a little bit different, I have a lot more flexibility when I deal with small press.
I will say that I much prefer to be published by a traditional publisher who does all the work that I am currently doing for other authors in my own publishing company, because I'm really beginning to understand how much work goes into publishing in a way I didn't as just an author who submitted manuscripts and got books published.
Yeah, I can follow that with my experience of the last books. I was published traditionally through most of my career by Tor and Bantam and Dell and other places. But as I finally turned in long overdue books for the Chaos Chronicles, Tor decided, we're not going to publish them. Your other books, it's been too long since your other books. And they did this unexpectedly and without seeing the books. So I undertook to publish them myself. And I went through, just for my own books, Ed, what you were talking about going through for running your own company was learning how to do. I knew how to do ebooks. I had been doing my backlist in ebooks for years. I thought I had a pretty good handle on the self-publishing process. But then once I started doing print books and trying to launch a new book, I discovered, wow, there is a very steep learning curve to doing this and doing it well.
I'm not sure I've got to the doing it well part yet.
No, I don't know that I ever did either, but
So, Alan, you were going to say something.
Yeah, so far I've been traditionally published. I may go to the self-publishing route eventually, particularly if I have a backlist I want to bring out. But for the time being, I haven't done that. I was going to comment on something Ed said. There are different types of editors out there. Some are looking to replicate the previous success, and certainly there have obviously been runs on dystopia novels or runs on vampire novels and things like that, where people are trying to build on something that's been wildly successful previously. But I think especially nowadays, there are also editors who are looking for something fresh and new and very different from everything they've seen before. So I would tell people who are writers, I would tell writers not to censor themselves, to aim high if they're willing or want to go the traditional publishing route and would like to be published traditionally. They should aim high and not self-censor and see whether that's going to work for them. I will say the timescales are very different. When you're in traditional publishing, it can often take 2 or 3 years from the point where you submit a book to the point where it comes out. That's what is taken in my case anyway, and I know it has for various other people. And that is quite a long turnaround time. And with the indie presses, often the turnaround time can be much quicker than that. You can go from submission to publication in a very short space of time. But another thing I would also say is that if you do go the self-publishing or the indie route, do make sure that you're being well edited. It is worth having outside editors look at your work, even if they're coming out just from you, from your own publishing press, because I've read good self-published books and I've read bad self-published books. And a lot of the good ones are the ones that have had a lot of eyes on it, have had some outside editors looking at it on the developmental side and on the copy editing side to make sure the product's as good as it can be. So you can't really skimp on that step, even if you are going the self-published route.
Great, thank you. Now we're down to about our last 5 minutes here, so I want to do a roundabout, and this one I'll go back to being alphabetical. Just how people find you, and what would you recommend? I realize I'm not going to ask you to say who your favorite child is, but as an introduction to you, that if someone likes this, then I read this one, and if you want that, read this one. So let's start with you then, Jeff Carver.
okay, you can find me at my website, starrigger.net, or just Google my name and it'll take you to starrigger.net. Has all my books. For a new reader, if you like hard science fiction, outer space, borderline space opera kinds of things, I would read my chaos books, starting with Neptune Crossing, which if you're an ebook reader, you can download for free, and that'll get you started on the series and continue if you like it. If you're a little bit more of a fantasy bent, I would steer you toward my Star Rigger books. Probably the easiest entry point would be Dragons in the Stars, which kind of takes you into the whole world in sort of fanciful way. If you like audiobooks, some of my books, all of my books are in audio, almost all of them. Some of them I would recommend over others, and the Chaos Chronicles books are narrated by Stefan Rudnicki, who's one of the best narrators in the field. And so I would go for the Chaos Chronicles books in audiobook, or Eternity's End, which is a Star Rigger book.
Great, yeah. Stefan is an amazing voice sound. He's done several of our, because he's here in Hollywood, so he's worked with on various projects. He did the introduction for us for Battlefield Earth, and just an amazing voice, just truly amazing voice. Yes. All right, so Ed Lerner.
For people who like short fiction, there's no question the place to start is Best of Edward M. Lerner. And that has going for it both that these are stories that are award winners or award nominees, or that kicked off some of my books. I'm best known probably for my collaborations with Larry Niven, 5 books in the Fleet of Worlds series. For those of you who are familiar with Larry's Known Space, or his most famous book, Ringworld, the Fleet of Worlds series ties in with that, but can all be read standalone. I also write near future science fiction, probably best known for my Interstellar Net series. And my most recently completed near future science fiction novel that I mentioned earlier was Deja Doomed, Set on the Moon. If you're looking for any of these books or anything else I've written, look for edwardmlerner.com, my website, and I'm Edward M. Lerner on LinkedIn and Facebook and Goodreads and any place else you might want to look. Just remember, Lerner is Lerner.
Great. Thank you. And Alan Smale.
My favorite child is always my youngest, so in that case, that would be Hot Moon, my alternate Apollo story set entirely on and around the moon. But if the Apollo program really isn't your thing and you're not really interested in an alternate 1979, and maybe you want to be in an alternate ancient North America, or you're interested in Romans, then the Clash of Eagles series would be for you. This is adventure on an epic scale in ancient North America. And I'm obviously very proud of my elder children as well. If you want something a little more humorous, short rather than long, then The Wandering Warriors by Alan Smale and Rick Wilbur might be for you. And this is what we affectionately call our Roman baseball story. We were challenged to meld our talents and write about our favorite topics in one combined story. And Rick Wilbur's is baseball and mine is Romans. So Roman baseball story, The Wandering Warriors by Alan Smale and Rick Wilbur. All of my stories are available in audio. I think the best audio book job is probably the Hot Moon book, which has been narrated by Vivian Lahaney, who is an award-winning and terrific voice actress. She gives my heroine, Vivian Carter, who commands Apollo 32 in the book, she gives her a really good, strong personality, and she's very good on all of the different accents, and she does a really good Russian accent as well as an American accent. She really acts the heck out of it as she goes through the book, so I think that one's great. In terms of finding me online, I have a fairly unique name, so I'm not hard to find. I'm at www.alansmale.com. And if we're spelling our names, Smale is SM for mother, A-L-E, Alan, A-L-A-N. And I'm also on Facebook and Twitter as Alan Smale. So happy for people to get in touch with me.
Great. And Ed Willett.
Well, I'm going to give a plug to my latest book, my youngest child as well, The Tangled Stars, which if you'd like far future, fast-paced outer space adventure that features genetically modified AI uplifted talking cat who becomes a starship captain, this is the book for you. And it's also one that I actually used a lot of my sense of humor in, which is also very much in the previous 3 books I wrote for Dahl, the World Shapers series. It starts with a book called World Shapers. If you like humorous stuff, I'd go there. If you like fantasy, probably my trilogy, the E.C. Blake trilogy, The Masks of Agrima. Masks was my most successful book ever. So that's Masks, Shadows, and Faces. And there's others, but that one. And if you like young adult fantasy, I like to recommend my Shards of Excalibur series, which is modern day fantasy with an Arthurian element. And that has its own website, shardsofexcalibur.com. But you can find me at edwardwillett.com, 2 T's on Willett. So it's WILLETT.com. Also, I mention again the podcast, The World Shapers, at theworldshapers.com. Publishing company I've been talking about is shadowpawpress.com. So those are the 3 best places to look for me. I am also on Instagram, and I'm on YouTube, where I do live streamed walks around my hometown of Regina. And I'm on Facebook, and yeah, I'm everywhere. If you Google Edward Willett, I think I'm the entire first page of Google results. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Great. Thank you. And this has been amazingly fun. I knew it would be. It was well worth all the preparations I had for this interview, because I wasn't going to scrimp on the shrimp on this one here and not learn about each of you, so we could fully take advantage of what you have to offer. And I very much appreciate that. Now, thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers of the Future series can be purchased wherever books are sold in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and available everywhere via Amazon.com. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Jeffrey, Edward, Alan, and Edward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, John.
It says we're live.
Yeah.
I thought you were starting us off, man. You go. You start us. Jay, let Jay start us. What's up, Jay?
What's going on, Michael?
You don't want to know.
Oh yeah, man. Oh yeah, man. Breathe in.